Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. We're going to wait a couple minutes while everybody gets logged on here, and we're going to get started on our program today, learning about John Sutter, construction of the fort, and the key jobs that were here. So first, I'm going to get you guys to be able to look around, see some of the rooms here before I get started. So this here is the west yard, and here is the central building. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. So right now I'm just showing you guys the inside of Sutter's Fort, and don't mind that big crane across the way. There's some construction work going on across the street from Sutter's Fort. So right now I'm just showing you guys some of the rooms so people can all get logged on. I'm gonna start with some questions though, and you're gonna see at the bottom of your screen, you're gonna be able to raise your hand. I'm gonna ask you some questions. First question I wanna ask is, have you ever visited Sacramento before? Raise your hand if you've ever visited Sacramento. All right, lower those hands. Who has ever visited Sutter's Fort State Historic Park? Raise your hand if you have ever visited Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. Oh, we got some folks. Okay. Well, who is excited to learn about Sutter's Fort State Historic Park? I know I am. All right. So let's get started. And I'm going to turn this camera around so you can see who's this guy that's talking to me right now. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jared Jones, and I am a history interpreter here at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park, a park that is part of the California State Park system. And I am an employee with California State Parks, but this is my state parks uniform. Sometimes I wear my uniform with the state parks patches, but I wanted to wear some 1840s pioneer attire for you today, some of my best clothes, so you could get a better idea of what life was like here at Sutter's Fort in the 1840s. And while it is unfortunate that you are not able to visit Sutter's Fort right now, we are closed during this COVID-19 pandemic, just like you are at home doing distance learning. Hopefully you're keeping in contact with your teachers, and I wanted to bring Sutter's Fort to you. And we are gonna learn today about John Sutter, the construction of the fort, the key jobs involved to make this place successful, and what happened to the fort, but also we're gonna learn about how we take our modern conveniences for granted. The pioneers, they had the same kind of stuff that we have today, but it was a lot more simple, but also a lot more complex. And something as simple as preparing a meal took a great endeavor. So we're gonna see how some things are very similar to what we have today as they had in the 1840s. But first, I wanted to show you some of the areas around here so you could get an idea. And I wanna show you guys quickly right outside Sutter's Fort through the big south gate here. So I could show you that Sutter's Fort is in the middle of downtown Sacramento. We are just a mile east of the state capitol building. And a mile beyond that is Old Sacramento State Historic Park, where the California State Railroad Museum is. So I wanted to show you real quick what Sutter's Fort looks like from the outside. We got these big buildings. They're right over there. That is Sutter Hospital, where they are keeping us safe right now during this pandemic. But I wanted you to see, look at that car going by. The street is downhill from us. We are on a high hill, and that's going to be important for when I talk about later about Sutter building the fort on a high hill. And we've got these big high walls, 15 feet high, And they would be originally made out of Adobe, which is mud brick. And they had these big white walls, not only a lime wash to protect the mud bricks from crumbling in the rain, but also Sutter wanted to make sure that you could see the fort from about 2 miles away. So we're gonna come on inside here. I'm gonna close the gate because as I mentioned, Sutter's fort is closed right now. We're gonna come on over here underneath the tree where there's some shade, because it's already a little bit hot here and I'm wearing a lot of layers. So we're gonna come on over here and we are gonna learn about John Sutter, the construction of the fort, the key jobs involved, and a lot of things that you might find similar to items in your own home, but these items are a lot more complicated. And remember to keep in mind, there's no electricity, none of that here at Sutter's Fort. So it was very primitive in regards to different tools and stuff like that. But you're gonna see a lot of similarities to items that we take for granted today. Straight ahead, that is the central building, the original part of the fort. I'm gonna turn this camera around to me. We are gonna learn about this guy, John Sutter. Born in 1803 in Kandern, which is in a small village on the border of what is today Switzerland and Germany. He grew up Swiss German. He always considered himself Swiss, and that would play a key role later in the development of the fort here and why he names this place what he did. He was born in 1803. By 1834, he has a dry goods store that has failed. There is an economic depression in Europe during this time in the 1830s. Dozens and dozens of businesses go under, and John Sutter owes the bank about $25,000. And he is actually about to go to debtor's prison before his wife helps him gain passage aboard a ship to the United States. He leaves behind his wife and his family in 1834. He eventually reunites with them 16 years later, but those 16 years that he's away, John Sutter plays a key role in the development of not only the Sacramento Valley, the development of California, but also the development of the American West. And he does try to stay in contact with his family as much as possible, but it is so hard for letters and messages to travel across the ocean and even across land at this time. It'd take about a year for a letter to get from California all the way to Europe. But he gets to New York in 1834, and he quickly moves on to the western point of the United States, which is Missouri. And he gets involved in what is called the Santa Fe trade, where he is trading along the old Santa Fe Trail between Missouri and Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he starts to hear about this place called California, how there is an abundance of land, and that there is a valley in the interior of California that has very rich soil that you could grow any type of agricultural crops. And he realizes that that would be a great place to go and settle, because like Sutter and hundreds of other men that left Europe during that economic depression in the 1830s, they were looking for a better way of life, not only for themselves, but also eventually for their family too. Sutter wanted to send for his family once he had a very prosperous society that he wanted to create. He wanted to create an agricultural society. And so he decides that he is going to go to this California, and he teams up with some fur trappers, and he travels along pretty much the Oregon Trail, what becomes later the Oregon Trail in the late 1830s. He travels from Missouri to Fort Vancouver, which is on the border of Washington and Oregon today. And he really decides that he is going to go to California, so he gets on a ship to Hawaii. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you go overland from Missouri to Fort Vancouver, the border of Washington and Oregon, to get on a ship to Hawaii to then go to California. But that's how the trade routes worked at this time. And the Hudson's Bay Company, which is a company owned by the British Crown, had a stronghold in Hawaii. Hawaii was a major trading hub for all different countries. You would not go to California before you went to Hawaii, so you could trade goods and bring new stuff into California, because California was a prime area to trade goods because there was no real industrialization here in California. There was no small factories or anything like that, like there were starting to be in big cities like New York or Boston in the United States. So he gets to Hawaii, but he misses the boat to California by 2 weeks. And he spends 6 months in Hawaii. He becomes friends with King Kamehameha III, the last king of Hawaii, and he gets 10 Hawaiian workers to help him on his journey to California and to be some of Sutter's first workers. And while he's in Hawaii, he decides that he is going to help captain a ship to Sitka, Alaska. So now he travels from Hawaii to Fort Sitka in Alaska, and then from there he travels down the coast by ship, eventually arriving in Monterey, the capital of Mexican California, where Monterey State Historic Park is today. He arrives on July 2nd, 1839, and he sends a whaling ship along ahead of him to announce to the town that Captain John Sutter of the Swiss Guard has arrived, and he throws a big party on his ship and invites the whole town, including the governor, Governor Juan Alvarado, and he impresses the governor, and he has brought letters from all over his travels, to these letters of recommendation that show that he is the real deal. He's got letters from the Hudson's Bay Company, letters from the Russian American Fur Company, letters from Hawaii, all over saying that this guy is the real deal and trust whatever this guy is telling you. And so the governor believes him, that he is this prominent individual in the Swiss Guard. And so Sutter meets with him and he says, I would like to live in California, but not along the coast. The Mexican government had only settled along the coast where the former missions are. There's not really anybody living in the interior of California besides California Native Americans. And Sutter wanted to live in the Sacramento Valley. And the governor says, okay, because the Mexican government tried 5 times to settle this area and failed every time. They thought Sutter was going to fail too. And so in August of 1839, Sutter travels through the Delta, up the Sacramento River, hooked over to the American River. The confluence of where the American River flows into the Sacramento River is just 2 miles from where I'm standing. And they noticed up in the trees, 20 feet in the air, there's debris and driftwood. They noticed that this area floods all the time, that these are 2 big rivers that must overflow during the winter. So we traveled up the American River a little bit, and there was people starting to get fearful on the boats because they start to see about 300 California Indians settling along the banks. They think they're going to attack, but they don't attack, because a mile north of us, where Sutter decides to get off the boat, it's only Sutter, those 10 Hawaiians, 2 of them were women, 3 sailors, and a large bulldog. That is Sutter's landing party. He immediately meets with the local Indian villages, gives them gifts, and he says that he wants to live in this area amongst them. And they even tell him that this area floods all the time. You need to build on high ground. So they brought him a mile south from the American River to this spot, a high hill in the middle of a floodplain. That is why I showed you outside the fort that the street was down below from where I was standing. This is a high hill. Floodwaters never really reached this area, so this was the best place for Sutter to start building his establishment. And in 1840, he becomes a Mexican citizen. Remember, California is owned by Mexico. And Sutter becomes a a representative of the Mexican government in this area, and it is why we fly the Mexican flag over the fort today. There's no symbol in the middle. Those official flags would only be issued to presidios and capitals along the coast. Middle of nowhere Sutter's Fort in the interior, we would be flying the Mexican civil flag. So Sutter's become a Mexican citizen. He's become Catholic as part of, in order to become a citizen here. And he has to build a structure on his land in order to properly homestead. And he starts to build the central building, which is later the original part of the fort today. But the central building starts construction in 1840, finished in 1841. It's where Sutter's office, the doctor's office, and the clerk's office is, and we are going to go see those rooms a little bit later. But this building was important because Sutter, in order to properly homestead and to fully live here, you need to build a permanent structure. Becomes this is now the oldest permanent non-native structure in the interior of California. This is important for Sutter to get a land grant. In 1841, he applies for a land grant, and he gets that land grant in June of 1841, a land grant that he names New Helvetia, which means New Switzerland, after his homeland, a land grant of 48,827 acres. It is everything that we know of Sacramento today, up the Sacramento River to the Feather River, and all of what is Yuba City and Marysville today. The Sutter Buttes were the most northern point of his land grant. And he had the largest land grant under Mexican law, 11 square leagues. And so he's got this big land grant, but he doesn't have the fort yet. And in 1841 as well, he purchases Fort Ross, which is the Russian fort just north of Bodega Bay, for $30,000. Fort Ross, about 80 miles north of San Francisco, another state park, Fort Ross. And he moves everything that he could move from Fort Ross to here. It's how he even gets windows for his structures. Now, Fort Ross is made out of wood. He doesn't move the literal fort here, but anything he can move here, a grist mill, tools for all of his shops, because he wants to create a trading post. You might think, with all these cannons around here, that this was a military establishment. Sutter did have cannons, but the fort was never attacked, and none of the cannons were ever fired in anger. But he has a trading post. And by the 1840s definition for forts, you have a big building in the middle, like the central building, and you have two walls around to surround a compound and a roof between those walls. You now have rooms for all of your shops, like a blacksmith shop, cooper shop, carpenter shop. Gets all those tools from Fort Ross, but he's got nobody here to work those jobs. And but Sutter's going to make some quick money, and he gets involved in what is called the fur trapping industry, something that had existed here long before Sutter arrived. And the main animal that drove the fur trapping industry was this guy, living along rivers and streams, got this big tail to pat down sticks and mud for building their lodges. They got these big teeth to chew on wood, and they have to keep chewing on wood to keep their teeth from growing, because if they grow too much, their jaw will lock. They won't be able to eat anymore, and they'll die. So they got to keep chewing on wood and stay busy as a beaver, because this is a beaver skull and a beaver pelt. This is the animal that drove the fur trapping industry ever since the mid-1600s, when fur trappers came to North America. And gradually over time, they moved farther and farther west. Jedediah Smith was trapping beaver off the American River just 12 years before Sutter arrived. But this animal drove the fur trapping industry. They're setting traps like this underneath about 3 feet of water near the entrance of the dams or lodges. They're setting these traps like this. They're gonna put a bait stick with some beaver scent on it to attract the beaver on over. They'd swim on over, step on this trap, and catch them. And the trappers would skin the animals, bring them here to Sutter, where Sutter is able to make some quick money. Sutter is able to get about a few dollars for a beaver pelt like this. And what they would do with these pelts, they'd put them on a big willow round. And these long hairs, those would be plucked off. That soft hair underneath is very soft. It'd be shaved off, boiled in mercury. Is working with mercury safe? Not at all. But it helps it bind together to fit to a mold to make hats. You know Abraham Lincoln's top hat? It's made out of beaver felt. And this is what drove the fur trapping industry. Trapping beaver to make a felt material for hats. Sutter had a hat maker as well, making wide brim, cheaper felt hats, because you had to have a wide brim hat to protect you from the sun, because there is no sunscreen in the 1840s. But a top hat like this was worth about $75 to $200. This is for the wealthy. This is not for the common farmer or anything like that. This is for the wealthy, those that are owning early factories in big cities like New York or Boston, putting on their top hats, riding down the streets in their carriages. This was a status symbol. This showed that you were a wealthy individual. So this is what drove the fur trapping industry, and Sutter was able to make some quick money trapping the beaver. But there was also now a hat maker working with all this mercury. Do you think it's safe? That mercury seeps into the pores of their hands, goes into their bloodstream, and goes right to their head and drives them crazy. And that's where the term Mad Hatter comes from. It's from these beaver felt hat makers. Another animal that Sutter was able to make some quick money on is the river otter. Sutter is able to make $4 to $5 for a pelt like this, and this was traded by ships along the coast. Sutter is able to bring them here to the coast, trade for other goods that he needs for here that he can't make or anything like that here at his establishment. These would be traded in Hawaii with Chinese merchants, and by the time this reaches China, it's worth about $200. And this would be used as the cuffs and collars on fancy silk coats. They also just wear the scarf just like this. This was another status symbol. Do you think I look pretty fancy by 1840 standards? Yes, I do. And it goes very well with my nice shirt here. This, though, the otter was traded for silk, porcelain, and spices. And all of a sudden, silk, like my silk scarf, enters the international market. And all of a sudden, everybody wants to have a silk top hat, which was a lot cheaper, shinier, and looked nicer than the beaver felt hat. So they want this silk top hat. What do you think this does for all the beaver fur trappers? There's no demand anymore. They become out of jobs. And so they come here to Sutter looking for work. And Sutter knows that these trappers, they possess a lot of skills. They know how to live off the land. They know the trails. They know how to communicate with the local Indian villages. So Sutter employs them to help him get people to come here. Because remember, Sutter bought Fort Ross. He's got all this stuff for a blacksmith shop, a cooper shop, carpenter shop, but he's got no skilled workers to do those jobs. So there's already an economic depression in the United States in the 1840s. Remember, there was one in the 1830s that brought people from Europe to the United States. Well, now that economic depression is in the United States. People are out of work, and they're looking for a better way of life. And there's already people traveling by wagon to Oregon that, you know, the Oregon Trail. Oregon's becoming very populated by the early 1840s. So Sutter is sending fur trappers back east to tell people, don't go to California, don't go to Oregon, come to California, and I'm gonna take you there. And quickly, Sutter's Fort became the end point on the California Trail. It's why I'm holding this wagon here. And you're probably wondering to yourself at home, Jared, why are you holding this model of a wagon? I paid good money for this program. I put on my best clothes, tuned in to watch this program, and you're going to show me a model of a wagon? You know what? You're right. Let's go see a real wagon. I'm going to turn this camera around here, and we're going to go see our 1840s wagon. This is your standard size farm wagon of wagons coming overland to California in the 1840s. Now, this wagon is not from the 1840s. It was made in 2002, so this wagon is now 18 years old. It's old enough to vote, but it was made the same way that the wagons were in the 1840s. What we have is a 4 feet wide, 10 feet long wagon. That's your standard size. So after this program, I want you to mark off 10 feet by 4 feet in your home and see if you could fit all your belongings in your wagon to see if you could fit everything that you own for your journey to California, because that's what the pioneers did. They would load up all their belongings, anything they could in their wagon to come to California. And they would have ribs, these wooden arches, so you can load up stuff even higher than the wagon bed a little bit, and have canvas to protect your goods. And we have this long tongue that would hook to a yoke. This is a yoke, and this is how you could hook up oxen to your wagon. Oxen are trained steers, male cows that know how to pull wagons, and you would have 6 oxen, so 3 yokes of oxen to pull this wagon. That would be containing 2,000 pounds of supplies, about 2,000 to 2,300 pounds of supplies. And the beginning point of the California Trail is Independence, Missouri. Sutter's Fort is the end point. It was a 6-month journey and about 2,000 miles to travel to California by wagon. So we're going to come around the back here, but I want you to think, what would you take on your 6-month journey to Sutter's Fort by wagon? Now, there's no stores or anything like that along the way. There's no really getting any supplies. You got to load up only your necessary belongings. You've got no room in here for your bed or even your family's prized piano. Only the necessary supplies. And about 500 pounds at least would be for food. And it's a lot of dried food, because remember, there's no grocery stores to be getting fresh produce or anything like that. You have to have dried food so it can last that 6 months. No room, and there's no refrigerator in the 1840s. So what kind of foods do you think you would bring? So think of dried stuff. Definitely you're going to have barrels of flour, so you can make some simple breads along the way. You're going to have a lot of beans and a lot of rice. Those are your dried goods. And you're also, Dad's going to be doing some hunting along the way for some fresh meat. And I forgot to mention, your entire family is sharing this wagon. Your entire family. And I'm not just meaning mom, dad, you and your siblings. You're talking extended family, grandma and grandpa, if they're around. And when I mean your siblings too, most families had about 7 kids at this time. It's not until the Donner Party that you have more wealthy individuals that they're bringing multiple wagons for their families. So what we got in here, we got some barrels that you would also have barrels of water. You're traveling along rivers and streams as much as possible for some fresh water. And you're going to do all your cooking in these big, heavy cast iron pots. Now, this pot weighs about 40 pounds alone. So think about 3 of those is 120 pounds. So you're going to have only a couple pots and pans to do all your cooking over a fire. And you would only bring what was definitely needed. A lot of people were dumping stuff along the first couple 100 miles of the journey along the trail, because they found that heavy furniture and stuff like that is not going to cut it for those 6 months. and you only had your own clothes that you were wearing and maybe one other set of clothes. So you're not doing a lot of washing, but you might have a washboard just like this. And luckily for a washboard like this, it served another purpose, such as you would try to have some entertainment along the trail. At the end of the day, you might sit around the campfire and you got a washboard, another wagon, they got a guitar, another one's got a violin, and you can sit around and play some music like Old Susanna, stay away from me. I'm trying to prevent COVID, so stay away 6 feet. I think that's how that song goes. Of course, I gave up a pretty prosperous music career to be an interpreter with California State Parks. What we also got in this wagon here is a grease bucket containing animal fat to grease the wagon wheels. Now this wheel is almost 5 feet tall, and you want to have big wheels so this wagon is nice and high so you're off the ground, because this is your all-terrain vehicle. Picture like a pickup truck. Your all-terrain vehicle. You're crossing all types of different terrain in this. You're crossing the plains, but you're also crossing rocks and mud and rivers and streams. High up wagon means you can travel across that, and you're not riding in this wagon either. There's only room for your stuff. If you're in this wagon, that means less food and supplies. Plus, there's no brakes or shocks. So every time you hit a rock, this wagon is shaking every time. You have these iron tires to protect your wooden wheel. And a job that you would have to do along the trail is, you see this piece of cloth right there? You had to count the numbers of times that that went around the wheel. That is your odometer. That's how you could keep track of how far you traveled. And you are trying to travel about 12 to 15 miles a day. 12 to 15 miles a day. And it would count about 360 times means you traveled a mile. Pretty boring job, but it was something that you could do along the trail. Another job that children had to do along the trail, you'd have a piece of canvas across the bottom of the wagon here for collecting stuff along the trail. Because when you would, you'd be collecting firewood so you could burn wood to cook with at night. You're setting up camp, you're gonna unload your wagon a little bit, set up your camp, cook dinner, which consists of meat, beans, and bread. For your next day, meat, beans, and bread. You get the point, you're eating the same thing every day. But you need a fuel to burn so you can have a fire. Well, what do you do if there's no trees around for firewood? Well, you're crossing the plains where there's a lot of buffalo. A job that children would have to do would be to collect dried buffalo chips, which is dried buffalo poop. You'd be collecting them and tossing them underneath the wagon to be in that piece of canvas so you could collect buffalo chips to burn so you have a fuel to cook with. Sounds like a pretty awful job. But eventually, after your 6-month journey, you have arrived here to Sutter's Fort, but I do want to note that you did have games along the trail as well. It wasn't always work, but it is important to note that you did not have video games in the 1840s. You would have very simple games with the materials that you had. And as I mentioned, every wagon had beams. And you also had old cloth, not nice cloth like my shirt, old cloth, that you could make some simple bean bags for a beanbag toss or juggling. You also had old cloth that you could make your own Pioneer rag doll. Not a nice doll like Patty Reed's doll, who with the Donner Party, she was an 8-year-old girl that traveled with the Donner Party. Her doll was made out of wood. She was from a more wealthier family. But a simple rag doll made out of old cloth, and you could learn how to make your own rag doll on our Sutter's Fort YouTube page. Ask your parents before going on to YouTube, but I go over all the steps on how you can make your own rag doll at home. And you can also, on our YouTube page, learn how to make your own corn husk doll. Because back east, there was corn, so you had corn husks. So you could make your own simple corn husk doll as well. And there was another popular game called the Game of Graces. It was played by two people, each holding two sticks and a wooden hoop. And it was like the pioneers knew about social distancing in the 1840s, because you had to stand at least 10 feet away from each other to play this game. What you do is you take your sticks, have them crossed, and going like this real fast causes that wooden hoop to fly through the air, and the other person would catch it. So you've eventually arrived here at Sutter's Fort, your 6-month journey. Sutter wants you to stay here because he needs skilled workers. And one of the main jobs that he needed were blacksmiths. Sutter had a blacksmith shop in the corner of the fort that had a forge of 3,000 degrees. That's 800 degrees hotter than lava, where they are putting iron or steel in the fire to heat it up to soften it. And when the metal is bright yellow, it's about 2,100 degrees, they bring it out using tongs, and on an anvil, they're hammering the metal into different shapes for different tools. The blacksmith is your hardware store of the 1840s. They are also making tools for all the other workers at the fort, even draw knives to shape and shave wood down to make wooden tools, because metal was very hard to come by. A lot of Sutter's carpenters are making tools out of wood. Some of the other things that a blacksmith is making, Sutter's got 2,500 horses and mules by the mid-1840s, but they're not shoeing all those horses. Sutter's blacksmiths need to make horseshoes for all the ready horses. Horses was your main transportation around Sutter's land grant. They're also making, in the blacksmith shop, nails, so for Sutter's carpenters to be making furniture and other structures. But also Sutter's carpenters know how to make a lot of this different furniture using dovetailing or mortise and tenon joint to save on the amount of metal used, because metal was very hard to come by. They needed it for other things. All the stuff in the kitchen, besides those big cast iron pots, those are being brought in here. But your forks, your knives, spoons, spatulas, even a hook to hang your hat was made in the blacksmith shop. Sutter had coopers in right over there, where a cooper shop, they are making barrels, just so that Sutter could transport a barrel of nails, a barrel of pickles, a barrel of flour, a barrel of wheat. This is your Amazon box of the 1840s. And it's a lot easier to roll a barrel than to pick up a heavy box. And the barrels came in a lot of different sizes too. Sutter's coopers are also making wooden buckets and butter churns, anything that involves hoops and staves, the wooden slats. This is very held together wooden slats. A butter churn, so you could churn a heavy cream that takes 30 to 45 minutes into butter, just so that you could butter your bread. Sutter had 4,000 sheep, where they are shearing the sheep, spinning the wool into yarn, and in Sutter's blanket factory on looms made by the carpenters, they are making wool blankets. Not a small blanket like this, this is just a sample, but a big wool blanket, so that Sutter can sell blankets here for about $1 to $2. Doesn't sound like much, but the common worker here is getting paid about 50 cents a day. So can you imagine working a few days just so that you had a blanket? Sutter also had outside the fort 10,000 head of cattle, and they're slaughtering 5 to 6 cows a day to feed the workers here. Sutter's got 200 to 600 workers depending on the harvest season. He's got cooks preparing all these meals in big pots. And a lot of times, the people here at the fort, a guy wrote for 2 solid weeks. He ate beef, beans, and bread for 2 solid weeks. You don't have a lot of different seasonings or fruits and vegetables if it's not the harvest season. Sutter did have produce gardens and also fruit trees, but they're trying to preserve as much of those as possible to have for other times of the year. but Sutter is also selling those barrels of pickles to other people for Sutter to make money. Sutter has 10,000 head of cattle that besides the meat, the valuable part of the cow is the hides, the skin, big cowhide, picture a big cowhide that could be tanned into leather to make a variety of things, such as belts, bags, shoes, and boots, all made out of leather. And the shoes were like these. And your left and the right were the same. So anybody have issues putting their right shoe on their left foot? Not an issue in the 1840s because every shoe was exactly the same. That's why if one shoe got a big hole in it, you either can just buy a new shoe and not buy two, but a lot of times you also repaired shoes. Sutter had a shoemaker that could make those shoes, but also repair shoes. You're probably wearing the same pair of shoes for years and years. The only thing you're replacing is the sole of the shoe. Another valuable part of the cow, besides the meat and the hide, is the tallow, which is rendered beef fat that you could render down to make candles. Dipping 30 to 50 times over a pot of tallow with a cotton wick, you could make candles just so you could see here at night. There's no electricity. So in order to light up a lot of these rooms, though, when it's dark, it takes about 15 to 20 candles. It was unprofitable to work by candlelight. When the sun would go down, everybody would go home. There were tents and shacks everywhere outside the fort. Only Sutter and a couple clerks actually lived within the walls of the fort, and they would need candles so they could read the ledger books at night. Another valuable part that you could make with tallow besides candles was soap, so you could wash with. Does that sound pretty clean? Beef fat soap. I bet that's what our blacksmith uses. But don't worry, you only took a bath about once or twice a month to begin with, and you didn't wash your clothes that much as well. Sutter had a tinsmith making tin cups, tin buckets, and Sutter also had thousands of acres of wheat that they're harvesting the wheat, cutting off the tops, and Sutter had big threshing floors just outside the fort where they would put this all over the ground on the threshing floor and have horses trample across it to break this all up. And then they would take it up into the bastions, the towers, in the corners of the fort. And on a windy day, that wind would blow away the chaff or the shell away and falls to the ground on big canvas sheets was the wheat, so that they could take this wheat over to Sutter's grist mill, which were two large stones. The top stone, the runner stone, moves around to grind that wheat into flour, just so that for Sutter's bakers here to bake bread. Right here behind me, this is an Orno, H-O-R-N-O. This is an Adobe brick oven. And this is where Sutter's bakers would be preparing bread all day. It would take 4 hours to heat this oven. There's no knobs on this oven. 4 hours of a fire, pretty decent fire, to get this thing heated up. They'd remove the fire and bake the bread right in on the bricks. Picture your bread that you'd get at the store, right in on the bricks. And over time, that oven is cooling down. They're making smaller breads. And by the end of the day, when the oven's about 250 degrees, they're making hardtack, which consists of flour, water, and salt. And it bakes for a very long time into a very hard biscuit. And baked into this can last for months, if not years, as long as it doesn't come into contact with any moisture until you're prepared to eat it. And this is how you could have a stable bread source where you don't have an oven. So Sutter is selling barrels of hardtack to passing by ships along the coast so that they had a stable bread to eat. Now, you're not just gonna take a bite out of this. It's a great way how to chip a tooth. But you would break this up, put it into a super stew, just like you would with crackers. And that's how you could have a nice, stable bread source. So the bakery needs a fire. the kitchen needs a fire, and definitely the blacksmith shop needs a fire. So I'm going to show you how to make a fire today, 1840 style, where there's no lighters or matches. So we are going to do this with flint and steel. This is how they would make a fire. You need three things to make a fire. Everybody make a triangle. You need fuel, air, and heat to make a fire. You need all three of those. If you don't have all three, fire is going to go out, which is why if you ever find yourself on fire, hopefully not, what are you supposed to do? Stop, drop, and roll. Rolling around on the ground, you're trying to take away the oxygen from the fire. If you throw a bucket of water on the fire and it goes out, taking away the heat. If your fire dies out because you're not adding any more wood or anything to it, you've taken away the fuel. So you need fuel, air, and heat to make a fire. This is how you make the heat. You see those sparks? Those go away very quickly, but that is my heat. I need something to catch one of those sparks very easily. And in a tin container, I have charred cloth, which is a charred fabric made in a previous fire. I've charred the fabric down, just like turning firewood into charcoal. This is going to burn, this is going to catch one of those sparks very easily. And I'm going to take that, once I catch an ember, into some rope that I have fluffed up, that's going to ignite very easily to then throw onto my fire in there. So I got my char cloth. I'm going to put this up here. Let me find a good edge here. I've caught my ember there. I'm going to put it in here like a bird's nest. So I got my heat. I got my fuel. Last thing I need is air. You see it's already starting to smoke. I'm going to blow on this. And that's how you make a fire, with just flint and steel. I got some wood shavings in there for now. I got some twigs. I'm going to gradually add bigger pieces of wood to get that oven going to bake some bread. So by 1846, Sutter has a very prosperous fort. There's lots of wagon parties settling here, but it becomes an issue. In April of 1846, General Jose Castro, the general of the Mexican cavalry and acting military governor in Monterrey, issues a proclamation ordering the mass deportation of Americans from Mexican California by the end of the year if they did not have citizenship papers. Well, a lot of these recent wagon parties that came in 1845 had not lived long enough in the fort, or lived here long enough to have the fort or to have citizenship. And they became very fearful of their lives, that they resisted this proclamation. So a lot of them, they banded together and they called themselves the Bears. And in June of 1846, they decided that they are going to take over the Mexican Army's headquarters in Sonoma. And on June 14th, 1846, 30 Americans from Sutter's Fort and the surrounding area took over General Vallejo's barracks, where Sonoma State Historic Park is today, took over the barracks peacefully and proclaimed California an independent nation. This became known to history as the Bear Flag Revolt. And William Todd, the nephew of Mary Todd Lincoln, designed the bear flag. It's got a red star, and he writes California Republic, that this was to be the name of the new nation. He also put on the flag a ferocious grizzly bear. I think William Todd was a terrible artist. William Brown Ide, who later settled in Red Bluff, where Adobe State Park is today, proclaimed himself president of the new republic because he was the only one there that could read and write and drafted the California Declaration of Independence. Stay in school, kids. But this Bear Flag Republic only lasted for 3 weeks, because on July 7th, 1846, Commodore Sloat and the United States Navy arrived in Monterey and raised the 28th star U.S. flag over the customs house. And this begins the American occupation and the Mexican-American War here in California. On July 11th, 1846, Joseph Warren Revere, the grandson of Paul Revere, brought the U.S. flag to fly over the fort. And he drew this drawing, which becomes later the most accurate drawing of the fort in the 1840s. But Sutter has the fort taken from his control. And this becomes an outpost for the United States military during the Mexican-American War. There's no battles here in Northern California. They're all in the South, but all in the Southern California. But Sutter gets the fort back in the summer of 1847, and he realizes that this is going to become an American territory. There's going to be even more Americans here. He needs to build a town. His dream was Sutterville, south of the fort here, that he was going to build this town. And we are going to continue this story upstairs here. I'm going to turn the camera around. We're going to go upstairs into the central building. And when we go up these stairs and cross through this door up here, just think, John Sutter, John Bidwell, later the founder of the city of Chico, where Bidwell Mansion State Park is today. Charles Weber, the founder of the city of Stockton. Mariano Vallejo, Jose Castro, Nancy Kelsey, all the notable figures of California history that have cities and towns named after them cross through this doorway just like we are right now. It's got these 3 feet thick mud brick walls. And I'm going to take this time right now to thank our doctors, our nurses, and medical professionals that are keeping us safe right now during this COVID-19 pandemic. And let's all be thankful they're not using this medical equipment. This is the doctor's office. Sutter had resident doctors to treat all types of illnesses and injuries in the 1840s, and people got injured from the craziest things. Falling off of a horse, getting kicked by a horse, cutting your hand with an axe or a knife. But the thing is they didn't have modern medicine. And a lot of these doctors did not have proper medical training. They might have read a couple books, went to school for a year, and that was it. And something like, because you didn't have any way to treat an injury with modern medicine, an infection from a cut on your hand might lead to amputation. These are amputation tools. These are cauterizing tools for burning and stopping a blood flow from going. You have a tourniquet here. We got scalpels, and there's no anesthesia as well. If you are during surgery, they might literally have you bite the bullet or bite on a piece of leather so you could bite down on during the surgery. And if you got shot by a musket ball, these are the tools to try to locate that musket ball lodged in you. And this is to go in and get that musket ball. And say you fell off of a horse, hit your head on a rock, and you got all this pressure built up in your head. They would use this trepan to drill a hole in your head to relieve the pressure. Would you believe about 40% of people survived this surgery? And now you got this hole in your head. They would take a hammered down coin and put that over the hole. Now you have a metal plate in your head. Doctors also did dentistry. Now, people didn't really keep care of their teeth during this time. A whole family might share a toothbrush. So you're sharing a toothbrush. And if you didn't even have a toothbrush, you're going to put crushed shells on a piece of cloth and scrape that against your teeth. But a lot of the times the dentistry involved was just pulling teeth. And this is a tooth key for pulling teeth. They would hook this around the tooth, twist, and that's how they'd pull a tooth. But look at how thick that piece of metal is. You think you could get that around your tooth? Probably not, but don't worry. You know, the reason why you probably had a tooth pulled is because you had one missing next to it. And they would use leeches for bloodletting, because they thought if you were sick, you had bad blood. that they would use leeches to suck out that bad blood, and then your heart would pump good blood. And they did not know about germ theory. They did not know that washing your hands or covering your mouth when you cough or covering your nose when you sneeze could help prevent viruses from spreading. So I hope you're washing your hands during this time. They did not know about germs, but they knew somewhat about sterilizing tools. So they would boil water to put the metal tools in to sterilize them. And they'd use this brazier, which is like your 19th century hot plate. If you don't know what a hot plate is, just wait till you're a freshman in college and that's all you have to cook all your meals on. But this is a small metal brazier that you'd have a small little fire or coals in to heat up. Could heat up a room, but also heat up a pot of water so you have some tea, or boil some water to sterilize your tools. And they did have 2 beds in the doctor's office. The wood frame made by Sutter's carpenters, and underneath they would have rope. You know the phrase, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite? It comes from these rope frame beds, because you'd want the rope to be very tight, because if it sagged down, if it was loose, it sagged down where all the bugs are. And there you have your chamber pot, which is your bathroom, not your everyday bathroom, but you're not going out to the outhouse outside the fort at night when there's bears and coyotes out there. You're going to use a chamber pot. And unfortunately, this was the job for children to do, would be to empty the chamber pot in the morning. We're going to continue our story over here in the clerk's office. So Sutter, he's gotten the fort back after the Mexican-American War. He needs to build a town. He needs something that could provide lumber. And in this office, this is John Bidwells' office, the head clerk here, he wrote the contract between Sutter and James Marshall to build a sawmill. Bidwell also kept all the ledger books in this room, and if you worked here at the fort, you were paid, but you were paid in material goods. Paper or coin money was not trusted here in California. There's no banks in the 1840s, so you have nothing to back up how much that money is worth. You were paid in material goods, and the equivalent that you got paid was about 50 cents a day if you were a common worker. Now, John Bidwell's getting paid about $2 a day, but doesn't sound like a lot, but in these items, you'd think they'd be pretty cheap. Like this knife cost about $1.50. But could you imagine working 3 days of work for that knife? 2 or 3 days of work for a wool blanket? A cast iron pot that Sutter has to bring in and trade for, you're looking at 15 to 20 days of work. A hatchet made in the blacksmith shop, you're looking at 5 or 6 days. A saddle made by Sutter's vaqueros so you could ride your horse could be anywhere from 20 to 40 days of work, just depending on how nice it was. And a lot of people bartered goods. They were trading one item for another. And a lot of that was done here in the clerk's office as well. But it is at Bidwell's desk here that he wrote the contract between Sutter and James Marshall to build a sawmill. And they located the site in Coloma, where Marshall Gold Discovery State Park is today. And I already gave away the next thing I was going to say, because James Marshall is building this sawmill, and the sawmill is almost completed. And he is checking the tail race of the mill, where the water flows off the American River through a channel to power a water wheel to go around, to move a saw blade to go up and down for cutting the trees into lumber. And on January 24th, 1848, he closes the tail race and he finds 3 pieces of what in that water wheel? 3 gold pieces. Marshall discovered gold, January 24th, 1848. 4 days later, John Sutter writes in his diary, Marshall arrived from the mountains with important business. That important business was the gold discovery. And here in Sutter's office, they test whether or not that gold is real. They find out that it is, and they try to keep it secret for about 2 weeks until word gets out and the gold rush begins. So we're literally standing at ground zero of the gold rush. They try to keep it secret for about 2 weeks, but word gets out. Gold rush begins. All of Sutter's workers leave the fort. They no longer want to work for Sutter for 50 cents a day. They think out in near the sawmill, there's gold the size of your fist in the rivers or streams. And Sutter is faced with a dilemma. He's got no workers here anymore making stuff. So Sutter is not making anything that he can sell to make money. And he's faced with a dilemma, because you see that cannon there that we fire often for visiting school groups. Unfortunately, I can't fire it for you today. I don't have a cannon crew. That came from Fort Ross. Remember, Sutter bought Fort Ross for $30,000 in 1841. That's how he gets a lot of the tools for the fort here. But by the gold discovery, Sutter still owed $20,000 to the Russian-American Fur Company. He had only paid them $10,000 so far. He owes the Russian-American Fur Company $20,000. He owes the Hudson's Bay Company about $7,000 and other individuals money. And all these people come to collect because they think the gold is discovered on his land, and they don't know that Sutter's mill is 50 miles from here. So Sutter is faced with a dilemma. He has no money to pay, but he's got a lot of land, and he has to sell land to pay off his debts. And the first pieces of land sold are the fort. And the fort quickly transforms from an agricultural and manufacturing center into a place selling, California's first mall selling goods to the gold miners. There were saloons, card rooms, a bowling alley, and a lot of mercantile rooms like this, just selling stuff to the incoming gold miners. No longer is Sutter making stuff here that could be traded for. These merchants, he sells to about 12 different businesses that operate in here. They are just selling blankets, selling shoes, selling shirts that they have brought in by ships, and they're selling them for big prices. Main stuff that they're selling, though, is shovels, pickaxes, hoes, tin pans to be panning for gold in the rivers. This is California's first mall selling goods to the miners, but all these ships, they're unloading the people and the stuff that these merchants are selling at the waterfront 2 miles from us, where old Sacramento is today. So these merchants quickly decide, I don't want to operate at the fort anymore. I want to operate at the waterfront, where there's been streets surveyed, and they're creating this town called Sacramento City. So these merchants move there and sell their goods right on the waterfront. And when I mean they move their stores there, I don't mean they just take the stuff off the walls. They literally take the walls with them. They take the mud bricks, they take the wooden roof and the shingles to build some of the first buildings in Sacramento City, where old Sacramento is today. And quickly, large sections of the fort are destroyed for building materials. By 1860, the only building that remained is the central building. And by the late 1880s, even that is in poor shape. It's got no doors, no windows, no stairs. The roof had caved in at one spot. This was in disrepair, and the city was about to destroy what was left of the central building because it was an eyesore for the city, and they wanted to build houses right here. But in 1890, the native sons of the Golden West raised $20,000 to purchase the central building and the 2 blocks of land. And they started to reconstruct Sutter's fort from 1891 to 1895. In 1895, the reconstruction of Sutter's fort was finished. And in 1895, Sutter's fort opened as a museum. And we've been a museum ever since, telling the story of John Sutter, how he built the fort, and life here in the 1840s. And the reason I know this information to tell you this today is because John Sutter kept a diary. John Bidwell kept a diary. Heinrich Lienhard wrote a memoir. Eliza Gregson wrote a memoir, and she taught other women how to read and write here during the Mexican-American War. Patty Reed even kept a memoir as well about her doll that she carried with her in her pocket. Eventually, the Donner Party was rescued by men from Sutter's Fort. They all told the tales of how the Sutter's Fort looked and the walls and everything. It was crucial for rebuilding the fort in the 1890s, but it's crucial for us to understand what was life like at Sutter's Fort in the 1840s. And it is important that during this time, we are helping to write history today. So I implore you, start keeping a diary, keep a journal, write about what you do each day, because you might not know that in 100 years or 150 years, your diary or journal might end up in a museum or an archive or a library where somebody is writing about what was life like in 2020 from a child's perspective during the COVID-19 pandemic. So write a diary. Start with today. I learned about Sutter's Fort from this guy named Jared Jones. He was wearing funny pioneer clothes and I didn't understand any of his jokes. But start to write stuff down, because it might sound mundane to you now, but it'll be incredibly important in 100 years or 150 years. I want to thank you all for tuning in today and learning about Sutter's Fort State Historic Park from me, Jared Jones, a park that is part of the California State Park System here in Midtown Sacramento. We hope to see you here soon when we reopen, but for now, stay home, stay safe, but stay safe and healthy. Tune into other programs that are happening all across the state from other state parks that are being offered online on the Port's website. Let's all have a great rest of our day, stay healthy, and tune into our Sutter's Fort YouTube page to learn more. Have a great rest of your day.